Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I'm back with 4 all new Valentine's Day decor DIYs. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you do, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it. Before we get started, I do want to give a big thank you to Essential Stencil for sponsoring today's video. Now let's go ahead and jump right into it. For the first project in today's video, I'm going to be using this small sign that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. I got it when it was on clearance for $1.99, and I knew that it would be a perfect piece to redo. This did have a top piece that already broke off, but I'm actually going to be adding my own top piece onto this, and I'm going to be using one of these small wooden pieces that I got from Hobby Lobby, and I just took my drill bit that was the same size as the bottom of this wood piece, and I drilled a hole in the very top center of this sign so that I'll be able to place the wood piece inside of the hole. I then painted the entire sign with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. I'm also going to be using one of these small unfinished wood candlesticks. Then I believe you can get these in a pack of about 4 or 5 at Hobby Lobby. And I'm using my folk art wood tint in the color Walnut. I'm just painting the wood tint on and then I'm wiping away the excess with an old rag. I'm using that same wood tint to stain the top piece that I'm going to be using on my sign. I did the same thing. I just painted the stain on and then used that old rag to wipe away the excess. For this project, I'm going to be using one of these 6x6 Valentine's Day stencils from this Essential Stencil Be Mine pack. These are so perfect if you're wanting to make some really cute Valentine's Day decor. If you guys are interested in these, I do have a 10% off code, and the code is CE10. I'll also have a link down in my description box. This is the one that I'm going to be using for the first project today, and it was the perfect size for the sign that I'm going to be redoing. So I just centered it on the front of the sign, and then I'm using painter's tape around all 4 sides to make sure that the stencil stays in place and doesn't move around while I'm painting. I also put painter's tape over the word love at the bottom of the stencil because I'm going to be doing the word a different color from the hearts. To paint on all of my hearts, I'm going to be using this 5/8 stencil brush from Essential Stencil. This is one of my favorites because I love working with this size brush, and I love that it has the natural bristles. The color that I'm going to be using for all of my hearts is Imperial from Folk Art, and it is a chalk paint. I just dabbed a little bit of the paint on the end of my brush, and then I took a piece of paper towel and then just rubbed that excess paint on the paper towel, because you want to have a little bit of paint on your brush when you're stenciling. The less paint you have, the better. You can always build up the paint color to make it more of like a deeper color, but if you add too much paint on your brush, you can have a bleeding underneath. So I always like to use less paint and build up the color. Another thing that I like to do is hold the stencil down around the area where I'm painting. This just helps from having any bleeding around the stencil, and it keeps your lines nice and crisp. I also like to stipple the paint on. I do not paint it in side-to-side motions. I go up and down and stipple the paint over the stencil. And this, again, just ensures that you have nice, crisp lines. Once that paint was dry, I then removed the painter's tape from over top of the word love, and then I took that same tape and then just placed it over top of the hearts that are around the word love, because when I'm painting the word love, I don't want to get that black color that I'm going to use on the hearts that I just painted. I'm using the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Rich Black, and I'm doing the same thing. I place a little bit of the paint on my brush, and then I'm wiping away the excess paint on a piece of paper towel. I'm then doing the same thing, just stippling that color over top of the word love to stencil it on. After the paint was all dry, I then removed the painter's tape from the very top of the stencil, and then I removed the stencil. Next, I'm going to be filling in the little gaps that are in between the letters of the word love, and I'm going to be using one of these brushes from this Stencil Bridge brush set from Essential Stencil. I'm using the smallest brush, which is this 5-0 brush, and as you can see, it's super duper thin at the bottom, and it is perfect for filling in the little lines and getting extra details. So I just used that same rich black paint. I placed a little bit of paint on the brush and then just filled in between all of those little gaps. Then I decided I wanted to add a little bit of distressing to this piece, so I'm using my espresso colored chalk paint from Folk Art on just a small paintbrush, and I very lightly dry brush that color around all of the edges of the sign, and then whatever was left over on my brush, I just very lightly painted that on the top just to give it a little bit of a distressed vintage look. Then it was time to start piecing everything together. I used hot glue on the top of the candlestick that I stained and then attached that to the bottom center of my sign. Now for the top piece, I did end up using my saw to cut off the piece that I was going to place inside the hole that I drilled. And I'll tell you why. It's because when I drilled the hole, it was not completely centered. So to save my project and not have to throw it away, I just cut that little piece off. And instead, I'm just going to be using some hot glue and then attaching that over top of the hole. But I was able to place it more in the center. This is what it looks like all finished. I think it turned out super cute. It was really easy to do and super affordable, and I really hope that you like this one as much as I do. Now moving into DIY number 2. For this project, I'm going to be using this unfinished wood piece from Hobby Lobby. And the first thing I'm going to be doing is painting the entire piece with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. I did use an older brush for this because I wanted to really get the paint in between all of those beads. So I kind of had to be a little rough on my brush when doing this. Then once that paint was dry, I'm going to be using this heart stencil from that same essential stencil pack that I used in the first DIY. And I'm just going to be placing that right in the center of my sign and then using some painter's tape on each side to keep the stencil in place. Then to apply the paint, I'm using my 1/2 inch essential stencil brush. This is another one of my favorites. It is the perfect size. And then for the paint that I'm using, it's from Folk Art and it's a matte acrylic paint in the color Wild Rose. I just put a little bit of paint on my brush and then I'm dabbing away the excess on a piece of paper towel so that I don't have too much paint when I'm stippling the paint on. Again, by using a little bit of paint at a time and then building it up is best to prevent bleeding around your stencil. Once that was dry, I'm just removing the painter's tape and then the stencil. Next, I'm using my 5/0 Essential Stencil Detail Brush to fill in all of the little gaps that I had left over on my heart from my stencil. I love these brushes because you're able to really be precise when you're filling in any small area or when you need to do some detail work. I love adding some distressing to a lot of my pieces, and for this one I'm using a small paintbrush with the color Espresso from Folk Art, and I'm just very lightly dry brushing this color around all of the edges of the sign, and then I went over top of all of the beads to make them really pop. Then whatever was left over on my brush, I very lightly painted that in horizontal motions going back and forth over the front of the sign. And this is what the heart sign looks like all finished. Another really easy project for Valentine's Day, and I love the simple and fresh look of it. Next is DIY number 3. For this one, I'm using one of these unfinished wood browns that you can get in a pack at Hobby Lobby, and I'm painting the entire wood round with my ivory colored chalk paint from Waverly. For this project, I'm going to be using this Happy Valentine's Day 6x6 stencil that came from that same Be Mine Essential Stencil Valentine's Day pack that I used in the other DIYs. I'm taking this stencil and just placing it right in the center of my wood round and then using some painter's tape around all 4 edges of the stencil to make sure that it doesn't move around while I'm painting. Then because I'm going to be painting the hearts a different color than I am the words that are on the stencil, I'm just using some more of that painter's tape to place over the hearts so that while I'm painting the words, none of that paint color gets on the hearts. The color I'm using on the words is from Folk Art and it's the rich black chalk paint, and then I'm applying it with my 1/2 inch essential stencil brush. Then once the paint was all dry, I'm removing the painter's tape that was on half of the hearts that are on the stencil, because I'm going to be painting half of them a red color, and then the other half of the hearts I'm going to be painting a pink color. So I'm still going to be wanting half of the hearts to be covered up so that I don't get any of the red color that I'm using on the ones I'm going to paint pink. So for the red color, I'm just going to be applying this Imperial colored chalk paint from Folk Art with my 1/2 inch Essential stencil brush. Then once that paint was dry, I remove the painter's tape from the hearts that I'm going to be painting the pink color, and then I just simply moved that painter's tape over top of the hearts that I just painted red, and then any of the writing that was on the stencil that's going to be around the hearts, just to protect them from the paint color I'm going to be using. Then for all of the pink colored hearts, I'm using the matte acrylic paint from Folk Art in the color Wild Rose, and I'm applying it with my 5/8 Essential stencil brush, since that was the brush that I had clean. I love the 1/2 inch and the 5/8 brushes for smaller stenciling. Once the paint was all dry, I'm then removing the painter's tape from the top of the stencil and then around all of the edges, and then just simply removing the stencil. You could leave your words just like they are, but I wanted to fill in any little gaps, and to do that I'm using my favorite Essential Stencil detail brush, this 5/0 brush. It is the smallest one that they have, and it is perfect for any little precise details that you need to do. So for here, I'm just filling in the little gaps that are on the letters, and I'm just using my rich black paint from Folk Art. It's the same colored paint that I used when stenciling on my words. I thought this sign would be really cute by adding some of these wood hearts from Dollar Tree. I am using 2 packs of them, and they come with a larger heart and a smaller heart, and they are in a combination of the red, pink, and natural wood color. I am going to be using 14 of the larger hearts, and I'm painting 7 of the larger hearts with my Folk Art matte acrylic paint in the color Wild Rose. And then for the other 7 larger hearts, I'm painting those with my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Imperial. And then for all of the small hearts, I'm painting 13 of them with my ivory colored chalk paint from Waverly. After the paint was all dry on my hearts, I'm just starting to place them around the entire outside edge of my wood round, just to make sure I have them all placed where I want them to be before I start gluing them down. And I did rotate between the pink and the red hearts, and then between each one of the pink and red larger hearts, I placed a small white heart. After I had the hearts all in place, I would then move one of the hearts, place some hot glue on the back side, and then press it down back into place. I continued to do this over and over for each heart until I had all of them glued down around the edges of my wood round. For the very last step, I'm using 2 strands of jute to create a hanger. I tied both of them together and formed a knot. Then I just saw how long I wanted my hanger to be, cut that down to size, tied another knot on the other end, and then hot glued the jute on the back side of my sign. And here is the sign all finished. It was another really easy project, and I just really love all of these pink, red, and white tones together. Now moving into the 4th and final DIY for today. For this project, I'm making a Valentine's Day porch sign, and I'm using one of these pine boards that I picked up from Lowe's. I had to buy mine at 6 foot 9 inches because I couldn't find a 5-foot board, so I just ended up cutting 1 foot off at home to make it a 5-foot board. But you can always have the people at Lowe's or Home Depot cut your board if you can't find a 5-foot board yourself. So the first thing I'm doing, you can see here, I'm just painting the entire board with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. To create my sign, I'm going to be using this 4-piece vertical stencil pack from Essential Stencil. And then the first thing that I'm doing is just taking the first stencil in the pack, the one with the happy and VA on it, and I'm just getting that placed on my board and making sure that it's centered. And then I'm using some painter's tape on each side of the stencil to make sure that it is secure and stays in place. Next, I'm taking the second stencil in the pack, the one with the LEN on it, and then I'm just lining it up with the first stencil that I've already attached to my board, making sure that it's centered, and then again, just using some painter's tape on each side of this stencil to also hold it in place. I then did the same thing when attaching the next two stencils in the pack. I just made sure that they were lined up before I attached them with the painter's tape. To apply my paint, I am going to be using my 3/4 inch Essential Stencil brush. I put a little bit of the paint on my brush and then I'm just dabbing away the excess paint on a piece of paper towel before I start stippling the paint on. I've said this numerous times in this video, this is the best way to prevent any bleeding underneath the stencil. And the color that I'm using is from Folk Art and it's in the color Rich Black. Now for the larger letters on this, when I'm stippling my paint on, I like to go around all of the edges of the letters first before I fill in the inside of the letter. Then I am going to be switching things up, and all of the hearts on the stencil, I'm going to be doing those in a red color, and it is the color Imperial from Folk Art. And for this, I'm using my 1/2 inch Essential Stencil brush. Once all of my paint has dried, I'm then removing the painter's tape from the top stencil first and then removing the stencil. I continued to do that for all of the remaining 3 stencils. If you don't like a distressed look, then you can skip this step, but I do. So I'm just going to be adding a little bit of my espresso colored chalk paint on a chip brush, and I'm just dry brushing this on my entire sign just to give it more of a vintage rustic look. Then, because I wanted to have all of the little gaps in between, or not in between, on my letters filled in on my stencil, I'm using one of my detail brushes from Essential Stencil just to fill in all of those little gaps. For the very last step, I'm applying this Minwax Polyacrylic Clear Matte Sealer, and I applied mine just using a brush, but they also carry this in a spray. And here is the porch sign all finished. I love how this turned out. It looks so high-end and it was really easy to do. I hope that you guys enjoyed today's video as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, I hope that you will consider subscribing. And I do want to thank Essential Stencil again for sponsoring today's video. If you guys are interested in any of the Essential Stencil products that I used, I will have a link down in my description box, and you can get 10% off if you use my code CE10. I do want to thank you guys so much for watching.